here with Elizabeth Oldfield, who's a friend from across the Atlantic. Elizabeth used to run a think tank called Theos. She currently runs a podcast called The Sacred, which I myself have appeared on. And she has a new book, which is aptly titled, Fully Alive, Tending to the Soul in Turbulent Times. And Elizabeth is somebody who you live fully alive. And sometimes when I'm in a room and I look across at you and, wow, she's really fully alive. Like there's a lot going on there, a lot of emotional, spiritual reactions. You're fully alive.
I hope so.
Yeah. So let's start with the happy subject, which is death. My wife and your close friend Anne and I taught a class for people aged 45 to 70. And one of the questions we asked them was, how does the onrush of death make you think differently about your lives? And they did not want to go there. They were just like, nope, we'll talk about something else, but we're not talking about that.
Yeah.
So how do you see this issue?
I love talking about death. I'm a big fan of, I am a big reader of Thomas More. He was a complicated man, but he kept a skull on his desk. You know, memento mori. It was a big part of the medieval Christian tradition. Remember that you will die. And it sounds like it might be opposite to fully aliveness, actually, but I think it is a core component of clarity and intentionality about the kind of people we're becoming, the kind of people the world might need, right? And so I started thinking about it very much when I was in my early 20s. I had a brutal accident, ended up having to move back with my parents, and they took me to a bunch of funerals in a row. Strange coincidence, just 3 in a week. And as you know, because you've written about it, when you hear a lot of eulogies in a row, it becomes very clarifying what people leave behind, you know? Not their job title or their salary or their interior decorating skills, whether they're hot or not. No one really cares when you're dead. They care, did you love? Were you brave? Were you patient? Did you show up? Your character, the quality of your soul. And so keeping our eye on that, on who are we becoming, because our lives will end and they are short, feels to me to be a really helpful way of rooting ourselves back into wisdom.
Yeah, and life would be just a boring string of daily existences if we lived forever. There'd be like no pressure, no point to it. I've had some friends who, at the end of their life, they really were sanctified. I had one friend who was a bit emotionally diffident, and on his deathbed, he just said, I think so much about my mom. I'm shocked at how strong that relationship is. And then another friend who was a big name dropper, in his final weeks, he just shed all that, and just his minds were on the poor and the marginalized.
Yeah.
It was a beautiful way to see somebody just say goodbye to what was lesser in themselves.
Yeah, that moments of moral profundity, you know, bereavements or a bad diagnosis or things that strip away and clarify the fact that most of the things we spend our attention on and our time on are very temporal, passing away, are not important, and are distracting us from these deep things. And so I'm interested in, how do we create the scaffolding? How do we take the rituals, practices, morally formative communities to help us not get distracted by the nonsense and keep our eyes on the deep stuff and the important stuff of steadiness of soul and loving our neighbor. And I am a beginner, right? Really, the book is very honest about how much of a struggle it is, particularly in the world that we live in, this moment that feels very apocalyptic. I can get anxious, I can get tribal, I can get defensive. So what do I need to instead be growing in the opposite direction, towards life, towards love, not to put it too cliched terms?
Yeah. And I'd like to get to that. First, I'd like to get you to talk a little about your own life. Some people write from a Christian perspective for other Christians in a Christian world, and they've been in the Christian ghetto. It's all in the fence.
Yeah.
You're definitely not living in the fence.
No,
you're living in a much more secular environment with much wider diversity of friends. You're also living a kind of intentional life, and the way you live. So if you could explain how you see your posture, your faith posture in the world, and then if you could describe how you've chosen to live.
So probably the most kind of unusual thing is that my family and I live in what we still don't know what to call it. The Times recently called it a middle-class commune. We call it a micro-monastery or an intentional community. We moved in with another family, and we've turned the garage into a chapel, and we pray this kind of monastic liturgy of the hours. We have, you know, shared bank accounts, a shared fridge, a ritual of hospitality in which a lot of people are coming through our guest rooms. We're trying to have quite porous, open doors. And that felt like more likely to be helping me becoming the kind of person I want to be and that I think the world needs. I have this thing that most of our spiritual, metaphysical, moral questions, we ask them in isolation. We ask them as individuals. We might read a great book, we might listen to a great podcast, and I'm part of both of those worlds. But ultimately, it is together, it is in community, it is in these covenant relationships that I think we can really change, we can really grow in the direction that we want to go. So yeah, we've given up some of our autonomy, some control. It's quite a robust set of commitments that we've made to people who we are neither married to nor related to. But I'm finding it incredibly life-giving and a space that people are drawn to because often they're lonely and they don't know where to belong and they're looking for something a bit more robust to hold us together.
Yeah. I used to teach a book called The Long Loneliness by Dorothy Day, and she was someone who not only served the poor but lived amongst the poor.
Yeah.
And so for her, all meeting was communion. It was you mentioned that.
Yeah.
You mentioned that in the book, and so but it's a tough life. Like there's not as much privacy as one would like. There's just people all around, but you find in that a sense of the sacred. You feel in that these daily interactions.
Yes, and I think it is a sort of deprogramming about what a good life is. And I'm interested in cultural stories, right? The way we are formed by these cultural stories. And in the mainstream, the good life is as much privacy, autonomy, control, as much distance actually from other people and their wants and their needs as we possibly can get. Because friction is a bad thing, and interpersonal tension is a bad thing, and vulnerability is a bad thing. And I feel all that. It's not that it's easy. It's really not easy. But the deeper story is that, in healthy, boundaried, thought out, pretty careful ways, when we go through those things, when we commit to live up close with other people, when we commit to lay down a bit of control and our very granular temperamental preferences, which we all have, there's intimacy. I feel witnessed and a witness to real human beings in all of their beauty and complexity in this life in a way that I think is quite hard to find in other places.
Yeah. Frederick Buechner, the novelist, once said, "What we want the most is to be seen in all our fullness, and what we're terrified of the most is to be seen in all our fullness." And you are living in that. And what are some of the rituals that you do as a community that just mark the day or mark the spiritual moments of the day?
Yeah, so we have found those old monastic rhythms really helpful. Morning prayer, we pray Compline, which is this, someone called it the lullaby of the liturgy. It's this ancient, strange, we use a Celtic version, and it's sort of a bit spiky around the edges. It's Christ of the poor, Christ of tears, be guarding our souls and body against the darkness of night. It has this slightly more ancient metaphysical frame to it. And so a lot of people who come through our community would not call themselves religious or Christians. They're interested. And we just say, if you'd like to join us for Compline, you're very welcome. And it is something that people are finding, even though they might be very dogged atheists, something about that before you go to sleep, a laying down of the day, is very settling, actually. And so we have these big open table dinners. We're constantly cooking like 5 kilograms of lentil dal for people from all over the community and people that we meet. And then we have these house nights where the permanent members of the community who are there all the time, we check in with each other at a deep level. We share the things that we're finding hard. And that is, that's the stickiest thing. We say, I'm feeling anxious about this, or I was upset when you did this, or there is a breach in our relationship that I would like to repair. That's very vulnerable because I get defensive.
Right.
I'm quite messy. My housemates find that hard. I find it hard that they find it hard. One of the joys of being in a hotel room this week is I can be as messy as I like. There's a bit of me that's still an individualist, that wants my freedom. But those scaffolding, those structures, monks call it a rule of life. We have a shared rule of life that forces us to continually attend to the growth of our character and the growth of our souls. And we've decided to travel in a direction together. And without those, I think it's actually really difficult not to be continually blown about like a wave on the sea.
Now, I once was talking about a book on TV, one of my books, and I used the word sin. And I got an email from an editor, not at my publishing house, but a different publishing house. And he said, I like the way you talked about the book, but I wouldn't use the word sin. It's too much of a downer. Yeah. And he said, use the word insensitive instead. And I was like, I don't really think that covers it. Yeah. So, but you have structured your book around 7 sins.
7 sins.
What was the impulse to do that, and what's your favorite one?
So the rebranding I like is Francis Spufford's, which is the human propensity to F things up. And when you don't have to bleep that out, I actually like the power of that word. I'm not a big fan of swearing, but you hear the brutality. This is about brokenness. This is about disconnection and fracture in my tradition. There's lots of people who would read that word as a kind of legal, right and wrong, in and out, punishment and reward, and that's a totally legitimate way of reading it. For me, it's a relational concept. It's about disconnection. And the 7 deadly sins, I did not expect to find so life-giving. In the UK, it's a sort of a meme. It's a clickbait trope, like 7 deadly sins of email, bulk fundraising, you know. But actually, funnily enough, the Desert Fathers understood human psychology. They understood these temptations to disconnection, the envy that comes from an unstable sense of self, the avarice that comes from trying to keep ourselves safe by possessions, the gluttony, which is about numbing ourselves from the pain of being a person. So it really, if you want to be fully alive, I think it helps to be very robust and psychologically realistic about how hard it is and all the things that get in the way.
Yeah. One of my teachers, Alan Bloom, once said, "Gluttony is the shallowest of the vices because you just fill yourself up. It's not as deep as pride and malice."
I put it slightly closer towards pride, partly because I think the deepest disconnection, or the first disconnection, is with our own. I like the language of soul. I quote Marilyn Robinson talking about it. Not everyone does, but if you think about your deep self or whatever, disconnected from that Frederick Buechner longing, right? Disconnected from the thing we actually want that actually helps us flourish.
Yeah.
And instead we distract and we numb and we stuff it. And until we notice it within us, it's actually really hard to move into these forms of connection, you know, horizontally and vertically, I would say, that help us be fully alive. So gluttony, I think, is, at least in me, a more foundational temptation to disconnection than I thought when I started writing the book.
And talk to me about pride. What is the sin of pride? That's a word that used to be a very bad word,
Yeah.
and has now become a very good word.
And we use it in lots of positive ways, right? It was hard to write about because I think there's lots of ways in which it's used now that are genuinely good. But the way it's been thought of in my tradition is Luther and Augustine used this phrase, homo inconvertus in se, which means humanity turned in on itself, like an ingrowing toenail. And if we think that humans flourish in relationship, in connection, as I do, then pride is the bit of us that does not want that to be true. That wants to be a rational acting individual, right? Wants or full autonomy, does not want to be interdependent, doesn't want to need other people, and does not want other people to need us. And that, I think, shrinks and shrivels us until it's really hard to be fully human.
Yeah. I wrote a book called The Road to Character, which was all about how you shouldn't care about money and material things. And I'm on book tour, and I check my Amazon ranking every hour. Like, how am I doing? Like,
Yeah.
So I had not conquered the sin of pride.
Yeah, I wrote a post for my Substack called The Soul Formation of Promotion.
Yeah.
Because I'm in this, you know, and there's a chapter on status anxiety and a stable sense of self. And having written about formation, I'm now able to be more alert to, okay, how is this forming me? How is this changing me? How do I both do a good job at trying to get this book out into the world? Because I think the ideas are important and they're not mine, without becoming someone whose sense of self is based on these external things that will not matter when I'm dead.
Yeah. And how has the process of thinking and writing the book changed you? How are you a different person than when I knew you before?
So what I was looking for was steadiness of soul, a sense of spiritual core strength, because I really do, you know, I have young children. There are days when the state of the world leads me into despair, terror. And I needed to dig deep into the tradition that is closest to me, is my mother tongue, and remember that it thinks a lot about the end of the world, right? It's an apocalyptic tradition. People from my tradition have lived through ends of the world many times. They have lived through the fall of the Roman Empire. They've lived through the plague, right? They've lived through, and that none of those things were fun. But in the best cases, they found resources for steadiness of soul, an ability to love our neighbor in times that are not prosperous or safe. In fact, the givenness of my tradition is that it probably won't be prosperous or safe. And it is still possible to love your neighbors and even your enemies.
Yeah.
And so I think what the book did for me is I wrote myself into more steadiness and more, not exactly hopefulness, or rather hopefulness that's not the same as optimism, but more of a sense of agency, actually. that I might not know what the levers are for the complex systems around geopolitics, climate change, changes in technology. But I do have a hunch about what it might mean to be someone who can go and spend time with my elderly neighbor and invite lonely people to eat a meal and spend time with people who other people have rejected because they think they're outside the tribe.
Yeah.
Just gave me back something of a sense of steadiness.
Yeah. What's the core spiritual practice? For me, the core spiritual practice, well, because I'm bookish, I read a lot. So, like, reading Augustine is like when I get out of his mind for too long, I'm drying up. I just want to be in the presence of that, or a Dorothy Day.
Yeah.
But what would be a core spiritual practice that you find is brings you light?
So I think it's actually in two directions. One is the contemplative, time alone. I use a practice called centering prayer. Others find different types of meditation really helpful. The getting down and being, for me, sitting in the presence of divine love. But I think a good start is just getting honest about your own soul or your own interior world, noticing what's in there, noticing the temptations, accepting, releasing, surrendering, all of those practices essential. But then I think what I'm concluding is covenant community collective practices, whether they're liturgy, whether they're worship practices. I go to church, I go to a local congregation. There's lots of it that I disagree with and find annoying, but it's got people who are not like me. And showing up every week, people who have different languages, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different religious and political positions, and choosing to be together, oriented in the same direction. And of course, in our home, collective. So individual contemplation and then committed communal rhythms would be the two things I'd say it might be helpful to go looking for.
Yeah. It's funny, as you know, I started this nonprofit called Weave at Aspen, and half the people I'd say were involved in it are religious and half are not, I'd say. But they have a moral calling. These are people who live in the communities where they work, and they just assume responsibility for the community. So there was a lady in Florida we met who helps elementary kids cross the street after school, and we said, "Do you volunteer in your neighborhood?" And she said, "No, I don't have any time." We said, "Are you getting paid for this?" And she said, "No." Then we said, "What are you doing the rest of the day?" And she said, "Well, on Thursdays I take food to the hospital, so they'll have some nice food." We said, "Do you have time to volunteer?" And she said, "No, I have no time." And so to her, all that was not volunteering, it was just neighboring.
Yeah.
And so there's some people just assume responsibility for the collective.
Yeah.
They have sort of moral set of motivations. They're not financially motivated.
Yeah. I think they probably have a vision of the common good and an understanding of human beings as interdependent.
Yeah.
That if we're not careful, we can lose. And therefore, your bad hospital food is none of my business.
Right.
Your crossing the road is none of my business. But I think we are enmeshed, right? We are entwined, and we are at best when we acknowledge that and work out how to deal with it, because it's difficult, rather than resist it.
And now you live in the UK, which is, I think it's fair to say, probably a funnier culture than American culture, but it's certainly a little more cynical culture, and it's quite a bit more secular culture.
Yeah.
And so in that environment where it's fine to joke and rib each other, but it's probably not as comfortable to just be vulnerable. What's your life like in that environment?
I think I have a very strange ministry to being the person who, particularly hard-bitten journalists, lots of middle-aged men, lots of overeducated people like my husband and I, partly on the podcast, asking the question, what is sacred to you? You immediately get to depth. But I don't find it difficult to get into conversations about what really matters to us with Brits. You just have to ask it in the right way, with a posture and tone of hospitality, not preaching, not with a hidden agenda. And actually, I think it's changing. And I wonder if this is changing here too. But what we're seeing in the UK is the dominant apocalyptic mood is meaning lots more people have lost faith in the idea that, if there's just more prosperity, there's more technology, human endeavor can solve the problems of the world. Bless him, Steven Pinker is still banging that drum. A lot of people have lost faith in it. Yeah. And when you lose faith in that, okay, maybe some of these older forms of wisdom have something to offer us, becomes a much more intuitive proposition.
Okay. We'll close with one final subject that's in your book, which is from acedia to attention. And attention is a big one for me. I mean, Simone Weil said that attention is the original generous act. It is the moral act. And another hero of mine, Iris Murdoch, said we can grow by looking. Our job is to cast a just and loving intention.
Yeah.
So I do think the attention we cast determines the kind of person we are.
Yeah.
And just one quick story. I read an interview. Mother Teresa was being interviewed by Dan Rather, one of our newscasters. And Rather asked her, what do you say to God when you pray? And she said, I don't say anything, I just listen. And so he said, well, what's God saying to you when you pray? And she says, oh, he's not saying anything, he's just listening. And I like the idea of them both just listening.
Yeah.
But so you have a chapter here on attention. Why was it so central to you?
I guess it is the beginning of everything. I also, Martin Buber, Simone Weil, Iris Murdoch, also some of my patron saints. And I'm also really interested in the work of Ian McGilchrist. And his phrase is attention is a moral act. Because what we choose to attend to changes what we are able to see. It literally frames the world that is visible to us, the people that we are able to be in relationship with, the stories that are intuitively make sense to us. And it's always been hard to pay attention, right? There wouldn't have been it wouldn't been one of the 8 bad thoughts of the desert monks if it had been not sort of hardwired into humans. But our tendency to be distracted from the important things is being weaponized against us in a way that I think is almost like de-evolving us. We are fractured and scattered, and fractured and scattered people can't love their neighbor. They definitely can't love their enemy. We're in fight or flight all the time. And so what do I need? How do I take back some control of my formation? Because what we attend to is the kind of people that we become. So again, collective practices and repeated rituals. I'm a big believer, Jamie Smith says there is no formation without repetition. And we see repetition as kind of scarcity, boredom. We're novelty-seeking creatures, right? And I'm trying to resist that and say, I don't need anything new. I don't need new ideas. I don't need a new frame. I need to take the things I know are true and meditate on them and try and embed them in my life over a lifetime. And that will feel boring sometimes. But I think it gives me a better chance of growing towards life than if I'm constantly distracted.
Yeah. Okay, well, the book is like a spiritual balm for ugly times. So I thank you for it, Elizabeth Oldfield.
It's been lovely to talk to you, David.
Good to talk to you.